Hello and welcome to another episode of Dear Rach and Soph. How are you today, Soph?
I'm very well, Rach, because I get to see you and we get to chat about a very interesting subject.
Yes, and I feel more alive than the last time we talked, so that's hopefully a good thing.
Well, you were coming off the back of a really intense period in which you were the organizer or like one of the organizers of the RWA conference, but you were there for quite a few days. So you're away from home and you were fitting in all sorts of things. So I think it was totally justified that you
Yep.
were powered down a little bit.
Well, I'm having a lovely time this week because I am between books, and it's a very rare thing for me to be between books. So in terms of I'm not editing or writing, and so my pace of the day is a little bit slower. I do a little bit of admin, a little bit of socials, I read a bit of books, I take my dog for longer walks. So I'm feeling very relaxed at the moment. So what about you? How are you feeling?
I did something quite unusual this week from a writing point of view, because I do have a very tight time frame to write my next novel.
Yes.
I plotted pretty much through to the end. Now, I've
Oh,
never
you're
done
up
this.
already.
I'm about a third of the way through writing it. And so I thought actually, because I have a lot coming up, including a couple of weeks of travel, that
So if he's going to Nashville, I'm glad to say that.
by
Like,
the time this is published, Sophie will probably be back from Nashville. but I just thought, well, I just want to get a sense of where I'm going here. And it will change. As we know, it changes. Once you're writing certain things, we have to go back and adapt. But I did plot it all the way to the end. I thought, okay, cool, great. I feel more relaxed now.
I think
So
if you can do it, do it.
yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's the thing, and each book is different in terms
Each
of
book
how
is different. And I also realized that we can hold on to ways we have done things and think that
much.
that's the only way to do things.
I don't think that, because I keep thinking I'd like to try and plot more and then I can't. So I'm trying to let go of the ways I've done them before. But saying that, I do think my process has changed and continues to change with each book, in that I'm slower now, but not better. Well, yeah, I think my first drafts are better. I always thought they were pretty clean in terms of there's not a whole load of typos, although I'm not a great speller, and all that kind of stuff. But now I feel like, and I'm going to touch some wood saying this because it's probably going to be backfire me on the next book, but I feel like I kind of have been through so many structural edits myself that I'm a slower writer and I think more as I'm going. And sometimes I wish that would stop and that I could just blurt out what, your fast draft, or what some people call it, the vomit draft. Because, and maybe I will for one book, who knows? But yeah, so I think it's good to just mix things up if you can a little bit.
Well, and speaking of going through structural edits, I caught myself looking at my grid. I've talked about the color coded grid in the past where I planned everything. And I was looking at it, I thought, I know they're going to ask me to go back and put X, Y, Z in, so I may as well just
So
do
you
it
did
now.
it already.
So I created a
I do think, the more you write, the more those kind of things. And I'm impressed that you did that, because you know what I would be like? I would be like, oh, I probably need to add a chapter here. They're probably going to ask me, but I can't be bothered. And maybe they don't, maybe they won't. So, but then invariably, as you said, they do ask what you knew, because you start. And I think I may have mentioned this before. You like writing new chapters, you said, when you do edits on you. Whereas I hate it, because I feel like I don't hate it. I find it really hard, because I think when you're in the voice of the writer in the first draft, I'm kind of, doing that. And to me, editing is kind of a different sort of brain space, so I find it really hard. So I should follow your advice. And if I think, oh, I should need a chapter here, I should put it in.
Except we're also writing quite differently in that I have multiple points of view. And so I think it's possibly easier for me to drop in.
Although I do in my women's fiction. But yeah, the book that I'm talking about, you're right. It's The Bad Bridesmaid, which I'm particularly thinking about, that I knew. And that is completely one point of view. And I think you're right. So then, because you've basically, if you've done an okay job to start with, adding a chapter feels like it's just adding sort of fluff, or it's filler kind of thing. You've got to really, that chapter is there for a reason. And so kind of moving other things around.
Yeah, it was you saying the voice. You didn't want to interrupt the voice and go back. And so that made me think it was just, if it's a single point of view, that momentum that happens.
It's the same for me, though. I'm lazy no matter whether it's a multiple point of view book. By the time that happens, I do not want to go back and do it.
You keep saying that this thing about laziness, you said it before. I'm just not finding it. Sorry.
Okay. You don't have to fight, but I know too. So we're not here to talk about editing today.
Well, except maybe our readers would like to hear about it. Just one more thing about your
Okay.
process, though, which is that I think there is something to say about momentum. So I do think if you're on a trajectory where you're powering through a story and it's flowing in a certain way, it can feel too jarring to go back at that point.
Yeah,
So you
yeah,
may as well wait for the edit, particularly when you don't mind that editorial process.
yeah. Although part of me, I get what you're saying, but a lot of my process is that I just can't. I don't think actually ended up adding the chapter that I was debating in this one. My publisher said I could. My crypt partner gave me the idea, but what I will say is, yeah, like I actually do prefer to not perfect things. It's never perfect, right? Even when it goes on the shelf, nothing's perfect. But I cannot move forward in my gut if it doesn't feel right. So I knew if I really think the chapter has to be there, I would have to go back and do it. So yeah. Anyway, all right. Today we are talking about chili, or rather, we are talking about spice, and not the type that you put in your food. Although sometimes what we're talking about involves food. I'll give you I'm going to tell you a story. Sophie's like, oh my gosh, she's gone rogue. So we're talking about sex today. And
sex scenes, just to be precise.
Oh yeah, sex scenes. We're not prepared. We're not experts in the other side of it.
Speak for yourself there, Rach. Come on.
I don't know. I'm just thinking over the weekend.
You have 3 children. I think that could be called expertise.
A sex therapist did a talk on a conference, and she is 100%, qualified in that area. That's what I mean. We are not qualified to give advice on your sex life or anything, but we are kind of qualified to give advice in writing about sex, because
you in particular, because you have written more books than I have.
Yeah, with sex in anyway. I mean, I've written probably more books. I think I've written more books than you, almost up, but no, not you've got quite a few, because you had some under other names and stuff.
Yeah, but I do think overall, yeah.
Anyway, what we're talking about is the love scenes, the sex scenes in novels today, writing them, reading them, a whole load of different things. But when I mentioned the food earlier, it reminded me of an anecdote, which I don't think you've heard of, but I'll tell everyone. So not when I first started publishing, because when I first started trying to write for publication, that my very first book was horrendous. I don't know if it had a sex scene in it or not. That was like one that would never see the light of day. I didn't know what I was doing. It was just basically writing me and my boyfriend from high school story. And the next book, the next few years, was all literary fiction. But then when I decided I was going to write for Mills and Boon, if anyone, I think I've mentioned this before, Mills and Boon has different lines. And the line that I wanted to write, the sweet lines, is really sexy. And at the time, there was a line called Modern Heat or Modern Extra. And it was kind of like your chick lit vibe, your young sort of 20-somethings dating. And it wasn't, your really alpha males and Greek sheiks and all that kind of stuff that the sexy line had. Greek sheiks. Sorry, excuse my... Sophie's like cringing here.
Greek is laughing.
Greek billionaires and sheiks. Anyway, okay. Now you've got me off the train of thought. So I was trying to aim for the line that was kind of your run-of-the-mill, more, kind of guy that you might actually meet walking down the street. And there was quite a high level of spice in these books. And I got quite close. And one of my rejections towards, revise and resubmit was something that basically I think my voice was quite young and sassy. I was writing this in my mid to late 20s. But so I fit sort of the sexy line in there rather than the sweet line, which was a little more mature in some ways, even if the characters it was kind of what we call a wholesome sort of sweet,
Yeah, right.
So I had a bit more of a sassy voice, which fit the modern extra, modern heat line. But they said that my, the sex scenes kind of weren't, working kind of, I can't remember exactly, but there was something to do with that. So I thought, okay, I'll fix this. And I wrote a sex scene with ice cream. And that's what, so I wrote ice cream sex. And that is why, Sophie's laughing again, for those who are not watching us and are listening to the podcast and can't hear her laughing. That is why I was saying that it's not the food. We're not talking about chili and food, but sex can involve food. On the page or in real life. Although in real life, I think it's a bit messy, but you know what I mean?
Well, ice cream in particular, there's a certain level of heat, literally,
Yeah, yeah.
body that will cause the ice cream to
Yeah,
melt
and I don't
quickly.
like all that, stickiness type of stuff. Anyway, and I'm not a big fan of ice cream, to be honest, but we're not talking about ice cream, we're talking about sex. So, as you said, I've written quite a few sex scenes. Um, I would, but I want to start with talking about yours, since you said you've written
Mhm.
less. So, do you want to give us a little bit of a background on your writing sex?
Yes, sure. So I did write some spicy romance novels, which were available ebook only before Sophie Green became an entity. And they were under a very different name and they're not available anymore. So that's why
Damn
I'm not mentioning the name, but they had quite a bit of spice in. So this is several years ago now. And I was certainly reading more of the Mills and Boon line of it, but I was a massive Bonkbuster fan. You know, I love my
Yep,
Judith
yep.
Crown. I love my Jilly Cooper.
Mhm.
Love a bit of Rupert Campbell Black. Those of you who read the Jilly Coopers will know exactly who I'm talking about.
Yep.
So, you know, I've read those for quite a young age because, as mentioned elsewhere on this podcast, my mother never censored my reading material. So if she had a Judith Krantz on the shelf, it was fair game for me.
Yep.
So at quite a young age, I was reading these things and
Mm.
finding them quite entertaining. And of course, I went through the Flowers in the Attic baptism by
Yeah.
fire.
I didn't read Flowers in the Attic because I didn't really read in my high school years that much. So I read Flowers in the Attic probably about 8 years ago because I wanted to see what all the, you know,
God.
yeah, what it was all about. That was interesting. And I actually then bought the second two, but of in the Flowers in the Attic series, but I did never read them. But yeah,
Reading it as an adult, because I read it at the age a lot of
yeah,
people.
yeah, it would be quite different.
What did you think? Like, just from a story point of view,
Look,
it
I have a
followed the whole
terrible
writing.
memory, but it was very gripping. But I also remember thinking, so like it still was page turny and shocking, kind of in the but I also remember thinking, I think, yeah, you do, you know, you're looking at things thinking, well, this is really, really bad. And obviously as a child, you do know, but it's kind of a different view. But yeah, I think it was I wouldn't say, I haven't read it for a long time, so I'm not gonna say well written. And I hate that whole well written thing, because who's to say what's well written and not? Like I get really annoyed kind of when people sometimes say, you know, Twilight was really badly written. You know, James's book was really badly written. The 50 Shades of Grey, you know, like, yet Harry Potter people say really badly written. It's like, who's to say, because all these books are massive, you know, successes. So I'm not going to say it was badly written. I have no idea, but I feel like it was very compulsive, and maybe it was similar in terms of the type of book, you know, that Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey was, in that it was, you know, just something about it. It's like on TikTok, we were talking about TikTok a little bit before, because obviously TikTok has a lot of spicy, sexy books featured. You know, on TikTok there used to be a talk, I don't know say, where it was like, what she put, like, is this crack? She put crack in this book or something like that. And I think that's the thing that people like, the, you know, Virginia Andrews, who wrote Flowers in the Attic, and you know, Twilight, and all that. It literally is, in some of the Colleen Hoover books, there's just sort of almost something in there that is like a drug that you can't, you know, and the majority of books are not like that. But if you've managed to write a book like that, you're probably onto something.
Yeah, well, you know, Taylor Swift has the line about putting narcotics into all of her
Yeah.
songs, and it's a similar thing. But yeah, the first Twilight, sorry, not the first Twilight. Twilight was the book, was the original one in the series. That was a great example of how to sustain a certain amount of sexual tension, actually,
Yeah.
through a novel that was ostensibly for young adults. And I remember getting to the end of it thinking, well, she did that really, really well. I think it was only when it got to the novels after that where there was probably more pressure to write in a certain way, at a certain pace, have certain things happen, that it wasn't that.
Yeah.
And got a little bit messier as time went on. And again, the constrained timeframes to write can have a real impact on that sort of thing. But yeah, sexual tension, since we're talking about sex scenes,
Yeah.
sexual tension, that first Twilight, I
And
remember at the end going, yes, she's
and
managed.
it's sexual tension that's just more important than the actual act of sex, I feel like, in books. You know, that's why one of the tips that I would say, and we'll splatter some tips throughout this as we just, you know, as they come to us, is, I know if you can keep your characters from the longer you can keep them from having sex realistically, like there's, you know, and sometimes I've written books where the sex happens in the first chapter, and then other books where it hasn't happened, you know, until almost near the end, and then other point the sex is the midpoint in the book, that but that tension, like another person person recently that did it really well is Rebecca Yarros with Fourth Wing. You
Mm.
know, the chemistry and tension between the couple, you know, it's sort of like not exactly the foreplay, but what comes like really before that is so important in terms of a good sex scene, because, you know, then you always have the readers almost gagging for it as much as the
Yeah.
characters are, you know, kind of thing. So that's one of my tips, is if you can, leave it as long as you can. But obviously the flip side of that is that it really depends on the character, and the type of story. You know, obviously if you're writing a book about a one night stand, it's
Mm.
probably going to happen you know, the sex scene is going to happen right at the beginning. And there's another interesting thing: sex is going to be different if your characters don't know each other at all, as opposed to those who may have been friends, you know, since they were childhood, you know, since they're in childhood, as opposed to divorced couple, you know,
Yeah.
break up sex, you know, angry sex. There's all these different types of sex that you might write about. And it's really important to take all that into consideration kind of when you're writing. But anyway, back to your writing sex.
But I think but what you're talking about is actually honoring the characters you're dealing with. And I think building
100%.
that sexual tension you do through developing those characters really, really well, because if the reader is with those characters and identifying with them and the tension that's building, then they are going to feel it themselves. And so it also gives you the luxury of that time to build the characters. If you want to build the tension, as you said, it might be about a one night stand, but you still have to make people care about the characters in order
Yeah,
to
yeah,
understand the impact of that one night stand. And so then it's a question of how you do it. Do you
yeah.
do it in the sex scene? Do
Yeah.
do you take your time with that scene? If it just say it's a story and a one night stand opens the story, for example, how do you make people care
I
about
think
the
that's
two?
where you like things to chips there would be to use banter, play into dialogue, and, you know, first impressions in terms of that a really good cute meet cute type of thing. You've got to show, I mean, there's lots of ways to show chemistry. That's not actually, I think you're hot or whatever. It's what you notice about someone, how you look at someone, you know, intellectual like connection too, like people who just connect about something on a, so there's like, but your dialogue and humor is a way to make, you know, people likable kind of early on, if you don't really, you know, or yeah, caring about those characters. You can do that pretty quickly, but if you have to do, yeah, as I said, that's a really good point. If you're writing a sex scene in the first page, just like, why do we care about these two people having sex, you know?
And it's the same with any story. You have to make people care
And
very
what are
much.
the stakes, you know,
And what are
because
the
I think
stakes?
that's the thing. With sex scenes, it has to change. Like, well, I'm going to talk about, like, let's talk about two types, because we mentioned a couple of weeks ago when we were talking, a couple of days ago, I don't know, it'll time will just develop, you know, that there's a lot of books, like there's a spectrum of sex in books, right? You have at one end what we call sometimes closed door, where you know, you don't actually, you kind of know the couple have had sex, or even they might not be having sex. It might be a, you know, like some YAs, their characters would not be, you know, having sex necessarily, some inspirational Christian romance, not sex, but there's like closed door kind of at one end. And then at the other end, there is what, you know, book talk's often calling smut these days. And I think that that category sometimes is misused, in that, you know, anything with sex in it is called smut. Whereas I would say that to me, smut is where, well, I don't really like that term, to be honest, in terms of writing. I feel like that's why I like the spice and the chili ratings, like
Yeah, I
we were
like spice as a term.
earlier. I like spice too better than smut. I know smut seems like it's got some sort of derogatory connotations to it.
Well, it sounds like something that a law used to be attached to, right? Like you
Yeah,
can get in trouble for having this smut.
yes. But what I was going to say is that, yeah, like, so some books and people are reading them, and I'm happy for anyone to read what they like and no judgment and stuff. Some people purely want a book with as much spice as, you know, they can get. So then you probably, you know, you don't want them to not have sex until the very last page, because that's a whole different type of slow burn, which, you know, if you can do hashtag slow burn, you can find some people who are really well known for the slow burn, and the intensity and the chemistry is there, but they don't actually do the deed until right near the end. But so you can have, like, if you are writing for people who want like spice, really high level spice, and they want lots of it, then you know, some of these tips that I'm sort of thinking about possibly don't, you know, don't necessarily work. I'm thinking most for me, when I have a sex scene in a book, it has to, as it change the stakes, up the stakes. It has to make a difference to the, either one or more, or probably more both the characters, but it has to make things better or worse when you have a sex scene kind of thing. And that means that, yeah, like I know people often say with romance is a formula to writing romance, right? And I I take I don't think there is a formula, because it's not like there'll be a kiss on page 30 and you must have a sex
Mm.
scene by the midpoint, and then another one. Like there's no that's totally rubbish if anyone says that there's those type of restrictions or prescriptive sort of things. But yeah, it kind of like matters in terms of what your character. So some characters, I've gone on a tangent now. I forgot what I'm saying.
But the thing is, you're basically giving us a masterclass on how to do this. I'm sitting here going, for anyone who's listening and is writing spice or thinking about writing spice, the tips you've just given are really important about
Oh,
stakes.
that's right, the stakes and
Yeah.
changing and like, so I feel like, yeah, I don't want a sex scene where two people just have sex because it's like, oh, I better put a sex scene in a book because it's a spicy romance and I want to you know pick this readership. I want to attract this readership. For me in a book, and this is a personal preference, so it depends like who your readership are. For me, and what you like, for me, I want the sex to mean something for both the characters. And that usually is, yeah, it's going to either tear them apart, make them closer. It's going to start, really make their conflict worse because, and the other thing, invariably, people often think in romance novels they can have sex without emotion, right?
Right.
Uh, and whether or not you can or whatever in real life, in romance novels, that usually isn't the case. And so once you have sex, you change sort of like the conflicts will develop, get bigger, get different and all those sort of things. So that's what I want. I want a sex scene to make a difference and to change, to progress the plot, and to show us something about character. And I think one of the other things too is I wrote and talked something to talk about a few years ago. I wrote a sex scene, and this character, I don't think she was a virgin. No, I don't think I've ever written a virgin heroine because that's the whole other, that's a trope a lot of people like to read. I don't think she was a virgin, but I would say she was quite inexperienced and had definitely not had a relationship or a sexual relationship for a long time. And I remember my publisher or editor sort of said, she's very dominant and kind of control, like she becomes a different kind of person in the sex scene. And I had to think, oh, why does she do that? And there was reasons, and I sort of worked them in. But usually you want the character's consistency to stay. Like you don't want someone who is super shy and to suddenly start doing a striptease the first time she meets her, or like you really have to have the character consistency. And one other thing I will say is when I read certain books, I'm not going to mention names, I get a vibe for the type of the book it is. So it's like it feels like quite a sweet fun, playful kind of book. And then you go into the bedroom and suddenly the guy is like using real dirty talk and like pushing around and all this, and it just doesn't gel. So to me, and this is personal preferences, and I'm going to ask you in a sec because you said you've read a few, quite a few spicy books, but to me, the tone of the novel has to reflect the sex scene has to reflect the tone of the novel. I feel like jarred out of it if suddenly the book seems to be sort of in one genre and then the sex takes us into a different kind of genre, if that makes sense.
Well, it does, because just to your point about the sex scene needing to move the story along and for the outcome to be better or worse and what the stakes are, if the characters are very different in the bedroom than they are outside of the bedroom, particularly if you have a female main character or an FMC, as now known on Book Talk and probably elsewhere as well, but if she's who you're attached to as a reader and she's changing all the time, then how can you really trust the story? It's basically you have an unreliable narrator there.
I think it's also probably a trope in terms of the male of the MC, as I'm calling now, the male main character, MMC. And obviously there's obviously sapphic romance and gay romance and all this I'm talking mostly because I've written straight romance and I'm thinking so have you probably, so the sides are there. But in that I think that when the male main character sort of changes in the bedroom, that job, like if they were always that kind of person, it's fine. But I feel like, to me, if I was the main female character and a guy had been one way kind of out like all the time I'd met him and around his family and friends, and then suddenly just changed the way he sort of acted, and
Mhm.
to me that would be a turn off, and it's a turn off when I read it. But obviously some people seem to love it. So
Well, and maybe it is a whole trope that maybe there is a trope about having a good girl character who's completely different in the
yeah,
bedroom. I'm not aware of that trope or and what it might be called if it exists, but
yeah,
it could. Maybe people could let us know if that's something they're
yeah.
aware of. But there are a lot of tropes to keep track of.
So have you had any, like, what kind of problems have you had writing sex?
I think coming up with different things when
Yeah.
you're writing quite a few sex scenes in a book and you've written a few books with them in, and also choreography.
Yeah.
And for me, that can be an issue. It hasn't happened for a while, but because I ride on public transport and I might find
Oh
myself
no.
trying to sort out the choreography and unintentionally sort of putting an arm or a leg or something, they're going,
People
no,
are
no,
looking at
let's
you
not do
going,
that.
what the hell is she doing?
Because you do have to think about the logistics, you know?
Yeah.
That's
Lucky I usually write my sex scenes alone in my office. So I don't have to worry about that. I have definitely had the time, like, I think you're close to all you're right. So sometimes you need a different set of eyes, or you need to leave your book, a few weeks to a few months before you go back. But I have definitely, and now I'm aware of it. I think once someone points it out to you, it becomes something that you think of moving forward. But I do know quite a few books ago, my editor said, these sex scenes are great. There was 2 sex scenes in the book, really great, really hot. He said, love them, very emotional, all this sort of stuff. He's a guy, so it's very fun in talking about him with the but he said, you realize they're like literally almost exactly the same in terms of the main male character like picks the female character up and sweeps her into his arms and carries her down the hallway and then throws her onto the bed and blah blah blah. And he's like, and then the same thing happens, the next time. And while, as he said, in real life, let's face it, possibly people do the same. We're not that creative all the time, right? Necessarily. It's just
Right?
in a book, you have to make sure that if you've got more than one sex scene in the book, that they are going to be different. And things you can do about that. I mean, I think you can have fun depending on the characters. In the book that I'm coming up now, there is only, so coming up in February, there is one sex scene only, and it happens outside. Um, and then I've had a few places, a few books like that. So, you can have fun with location as
Yeah.
well. That can
Again,
be quite
logistics, you got to think about grass and
yeah, and
rocks
sand.
and
And that's what that brings me to being like, how much realism do people want in reading sex, right?
it really depends on the book you're reading, right? So if it's one of your novels, then I would want it to be realistic because otherwise it's
So if there's sand going up the heroine's butt, do you want her to mention that?
oh, I see what you mean. Whether I thought you meant with the whole scene, like, is it how realistic would it be?
Or
I think
both,
it,
I
I
guess.
think if the sand is pertinent to the storytelling, like if it's because that could also add a bit of humor, right? If
Exactly.
there's
Yeah.
sand getting into places that you don't necessarily want it, well, maybe that's an opportunity for the characters to have a bit of banter.
And what about things like, because I remember, so I don't know if you've ever read Jennifer Cruzy. She's a really great sort of,
I have.
I'd say she's romantic comedy, but you never, but
I
anyway,
feel like I've read one, but I can't
she
remember it.
hasn't written a book for a few years, or she did, I think she did do a co-writing one, I think. But she has some of the funniest sex scenes, and if I'd had time, I would have like looked them up. But like, she's got ones where, you know, the person, nobody comes, nobody like hasn't, and it's like really awkward, like just things that happen probably, in real life.
Yeah.
And also, yeah, the humor during conversations, or people doing it when, like, if you can bring humor and conversation and dialogue into your sex scenes, there are ways to make it stand out and be original. So I think, yeah, like making it real to an extent, and not necessarily perfect, because so I guess it's a balance though, isn't it, between the fantasy. I mean, people read romance for the fantasy in a way of
Yeah.
falling in love, having this relationship that is perfect, as close to perfect on all levels, right? You've got intellectual connection, you've got physical connection, you like each other, all that sort of stuff. And so the fantasy, part of the fantasy is, I guess, having a satisfying, sex life with that person. But at the same time, like, I quite like it when, it is a little bit realistic, and people have to, work through those issues as well, if that's part of the story. I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess it comes down to everyone's taste and yes, exactly what they want and how they want to spend their time. And people can change. Readers can change what they want. And one moment they want something that's 5 chili spices and has all the trigger warnings imaginable. But then they also be quite happy reading something that is far more realistic with a bit of humor and banter in it.
And it probably depends on subgenre, right? Because, like, if you are writing romantic comedy, then bring the comedy into the bedroom as well, like, but if you're not, then you might not necessarily, want that. And also, like, if it's been a sad scene or something, it depends why people are having sex. So really, think about all those reasons. And that's ways to make the sex scene different. My biggest tip, though, is forget about your grandma. I know when I first, that's what I always say when people ask how do you write sex scenes? It's like, don't think about anyone reading them, basically, or anyone reading them. I'm fine now because I've written a lot, and I know that people, and mine, I would say, are quite tame compared to, some books, but there's also a lot, more in there than other books and stuff. So it really depends. Like, I've had people come up to me, oh, I really liked your book. I couldn't believe that you write those sort of scenes. Sweet girl writing those scenes. And I'm like, darling, you haven't read, mine is so tame. If you think that's bad, you should read some, So it really depends, but people will think about those sort of, like, I mean, most sort of romance novelists I know have at one stage or another, or their partner's been asked, do you practice those scenes with your, husband or your, whatever? And usually my husband would be like, I wish, she's just the computer all the time. So, I'm like, you know what I mean? Like, people need to remember that it's fictional, and people don't ask, like, crime writers, have you actually murdered someone? Have you, but people will think those things. So I think in order to write sex, you either have to use a pseudonym if you're really worried about stuff like that, or you have to go, just, who cares? It doesn't matter. Because if you're worried about what people are going to say or think about it, then that's going to come across on the page, and you're going to, like, I think you always say, hold your nerve, right?
Yeah.
And I think that kind of comes across in the sex in terms of, you really can't let those sort of worries enter it, or you're going to, it's going to be a thing. But I always use this, don't forget about your grandma.
And also, if you're holding on too tightly, if you're overthinking it, it's going to show on the page. So if you're really thinking, I really have to make this sexy for these, so this works for these readers, then just try to relax and do it. Have as much fun as you hope your characters are having. And also what the fun that you want your readers to have when they're reading it.
Yeah, exactly.
And one point I did think of before we started this discussion, and I think it's a really significant one in terms of readers and writers, which is that a lot of the reason I think why women flock to spicy books and they read masses of them, and they have done for decades, is because usually the sex in those books is being written from the perspective of the female gaze and the female experience, whereas most screened entertainment, when it involves sex, and I include PORN and that, is from the male gaze. And women can feel unsafe when they're experiencing sex scenes from the perspective of the male gaze,
that's a really
just
good
on an
point.
instinctual level. Whereas I think even with some pretty full-on spicy books with trigger warnings and all those sorts of things, and those warnings are given up front for good reason, but when the writer is a woman, and you know that sex is being written from the female perspective and from the female gaze, there's just something about it that makes you feel, I'm okay here. Like, whatever's going to happen here, and I can move on. And because it's a book, I can actually choose to not read that scene if I don't want to, and I can move on from there. So,
and people do say they skip sex scenes.
Well,
Personally, I don't think you should be able to, though. That's a kind of a tip there. So if you can skip a sex scene in a book, if a reader can skip a sex scene, then it shouldn't have been there in the first place. Should have possibly just closed the door, because we didn't need necessarily that,
Because it was gratuitous then, if it wasn't. Yeah.
But
But
you're right in the female gaze thing. I think that's really interesting, and I also think that this is why I've said until the advance of, sorry, I can't remember the word I'm thinking, until the invention of TikTok or the beginning of TikTok a few years ago, where a lot of now, a lot of the romance novels, some like there's concerns about some young people reading them because the bully romance and the way sometimes there's even rape fantasies and kidnapping, all this sort of stuff that we don't really want to condone in real life. So there's that aspect prior to those sort of things having their sort of day when they were more of a niche market. I would think that like teenage boys should be forced to read some good romance novels, and men should read romance novels who want to improve their relationships, because this is the female fantasy, right? So if you
it's a handbook.
a woman, just read a few romance novels. A, you'll get some tips. B, you'll get kudos for picking it up.
C, you may have fun reading the story.
No, May, you definitely will. You'll get hooked. I mean, I do have a number of male readers. I'm sure you do too, in both my women's fiction and my romance novels. And what I find really interesting, and this is not so much the sex, I don't think they're there for reading that necessarily, but when I've asked a couple of them various times over the years, because most of them came to me through, I think more of them read the rural romance than they do the sort of general.
Because they like the landscape setting, probably.
Oh, well, no, not exactly. That's what I thought. But then when you ask them, they're not reading it for the rural. Maybe that's why it gives them an excuse to read it. That they think, but they read it for the romance, because let's face it, we all like connection, right? We all like, having the fantasy is having, someone who understands us and on so many levels and stuff. And that's what they love it too. So I think that's the thing. Men and women both read romance, but I do think I love what you've said about that romance traditionally and mostly still has written for a female gaze rather than, and I think that there's so much there to interesting unpack, and that brings us to the consent issue, because I think we can't talk about writing sex scenes without talking about consent, especially it's interesting because since Me Too, it's been something that we've as romance writers definitely had more conversations about, and publishers a bit more wary. Interesting from a publishing perspective, but I know I've been told. So my book Outback Secrets, it starts with the main female character getting a bit drunk, which used to be a no-no too. Like this is why you can break rules, people. So it was like your characters have to be likable. Your girl can't get drunk, and do some anyway. You can break all those rules, but she gets drunk for reason. So that's the thing. Everything needs to have motivation, right? And reason, whether it's sex or normal characters. She gets very, very drunk in the first chapter, and he ends up finding her after, because he owns the pub, after it's all closed down. He finds her asleep somewhere. In my very first chapter, or my very first draft, he found her asleep in the bathroom, and he carried her upstairs to his room and put her to bed. And the publishers were like, whoa. And I thought, because we're in his point of view, we know he's not a bad guy. We know that he's thinking, I better look after her so she doesn't, get sick or wake up wondering where she is, and I want her to have a good night's sleep, I want her to be safe. So we know that and he's not going to sleep in the bed with her, he's taking the couch. We're in his point of view, so we know he is a good person and he's not going to take advantage of her. And it's also the type of novel I write. You're not going to have that, but the publishers were really, really wary of that, and they got me to change it into. So I had to, because it's a very pivotal scene and it needed to happen, I then had to make it she fell asleep on a couch just in the, rather than he found there. And then he's trying to take her upstairs to another room in the pub, but, I had to really create sort of obstacles that got in their way, like the joint bathroom. She needs to go to the toilet, and the joint bathroom for the guest is used by someone else. So then he says, you can use mine, and she ends up. So I had to really make, it.
Yeah, and I'm kind of confused about that feedback, because the way you've recounted that scene, he was removing her from potential danger by taking.
And it was in his point of view, like if we're in her point of view, which you can't be because she's drunk and passed out. So,
right.
But like if you're in her point of view, I can understand that we wouldn't know necessarily,
It's also kind of denying the male character the ability to help that woman. So that removes a dimension from him.
And it's also, yeah, I mean, I did change it, but I kind of, yeah, I sort of almost wish that I'd stood up about that. But I mean, that's in the end one thing, and actually has gone off on a tangent. But in terms of, do you talk about condoms? Do you talk about safe sex? Because I know a lot of romance writers are like, that can really interrupt a scene. It's like, oh, they're getting it on.
It can, because it's a
And then suddenly
choreographic
it's like,
thing.
oh, do you have protection, or do you mind if I touch this? And like, it kind of it can really. So the whole thing is, how you handle that. And do you think there should be conversations about contraception in books, and
Well,
or do you ask consent?
The condom one's an interesting one, because that can be a choreography issue as well.
Yeah.
So it's actually just from a pure logistics point of view. There was
But if you don't talk about a condom or birth control or anything like that, then people immediately think you might be writing an accidental pregnancy. So
yeah, that's true. There was a spicy book I was reading recently that did it really, really well, actually. And I remember thinking, from a writing point of view, it was like, this has been done so seamlessly, but so clearly that this is the way to do it. It was just it was all part of the choreography. Again, I keep using that term because there is choreography involved.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also like, though, like, whether someone's prepared or not can depend on whether they think they're about to, like, and a guy who's always got a condom in his pocket, like, is it a good thing or is it
These
a bad
characters were totally that. Let's put it that way. These characters were totally like that, and therefore it made sense. And I think that's why.
Again, it depends on the characters, and that's why I think you've got to be careful of rules in terms of, but the whole consent thing, like, of saying, making sure it's, explicit on the page. I get that, especially when there's a lot of young, teenagers reading these things too. We want to make sure that consent, it's kind of our responsibility, I suppose, to show, good sex and good consent, like, so that people, but at the same time, I feel like romance as a genre in general, and there's some, like the dark romances and stuff, which are a different thing. Like, as I said, with my books, the type of book I write, it's never going to be unconsensual. Is that the word? Unconsensual?
Yeah, because of the character development.
Yeah, and so the only time they're going to have sex is when they're both 100%. So then, do I have to, explicitly put that? Yeah.
Well, I think then you ask yourself, in life, would that be explicitly said between two people who have
clearly already got? Yeah.
So
it's hard because so I think these are all things you have to think about now that people would not necessarily have thought about when they were writing romance even 10 years ago.
You have to think about them, but also there's an element of thinking, if I don't put it in, am I then going to get flack for not putting it in? Even if in life, when these people know each other this well, there would be elements of communication, unspoken,
but so it is something that you all need to think about if you're writing a sex scene, like how you're going to show that consent. I think, like, unless it's a book where
treat it as a fun writing challenge, I guess, is
and that's the thing, you can have real fun. Like, I've had stages, where it's like, oh, hang on, they're about to get on, there's no like, and then you just work it into the story, and each, and it's a way to make sex scenes original as well and unique from the run before, because who has it, how they have it, where do they need to go and find contraception, or do they do something else because they don't have contraception that time? So and that's the other thing, I suppose. Sex in books doesn't have to be, intercourse necessarily. So
it's such a great, but just really great word, because it's functionally great in terms of, but God, it just doesn't sound that nice.
No, it does not.
No, it's kind of a harsh.
You don't want your heroes or your male main characters sitting there and, do you mind if we have intercourse now?
I think it was very popular in like the 70s or something.
100% of a turn off. I do mind. You leave. There's the door. So I'm just thinking, look at my notes about anything else that we. What about another problem I've had in writing sex is characters that just won't get it on. Sometimes you get characters, and this is the thing when characters take over, right? And they need to, because you want your characters to, act.
Yeah. Oh, they totally take over. Yes.
Yeah, and so that's good on one level. But it's really hard then if you have two people who, if your conflict's so good that, they won't just won't get it on. The other problem is if they just won't stop getting it on, and you're like, you guys have had enough now. I need to progress the story in a different way. So, there's all these issues that you have writing sex.
Have you ever reached a point where the two characters simply won't get it on and you thought, oh God, maybe they don't actually like each other that way. Maybe
Yes,
I'm in the
I
wrong
have.
direction here.
And yes, but they did really like each other. And so that happened in Outback Secrets in my first, my first version. So I've mentioned this before, I think, that I wrote 30,000 words of one, main female character, and then 35,000 with another before I scrapped them both and started again, And the first female main character and the male main character, this is the same throughout the books, they were childhood friends, high school friends, but he'd always had a crush on her kind of thing. But she married his best friend, and the best friend was now dead. And they just weren't going to do it. Like, I just could not get them to get it on. So I scrapped them. So yeah.
There you
These
go.
characters need to know, if you don't do what you say, you'll be turned, and I'll find other characters who will get it on.
If sexy time is required, then you're going to have it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, what else? We've done a good chat about sex. We probably should wrap things up soon. But have you got anything else?
Possibly. There was one thing I've written down, which is saying that I wonder, well, perhaps with your novels, if you have a predetermined spice level when you go in, like you think, I'm going to write these sex scenes and they're going to be this sort of level of spice, not necessarily the content of them.
Yeah.
Spice. And so have you ever been surprised?
I was surprised, I think, in Talk to the Heart. The hero, maybe it's because I was reading quite a lot of TikTok romance books at the time, but the hero was a lot more mouthy in the bedroom than I, imagined. But also,
Rachel, that could be taken a few different ways.
I know. Maybe he was in all those ways. But no, I kind of think that so as I said, we talked about closed door before versus like open door. So closed door, it's sort of, sometimes they're called clean romances and sweet romances, but usually either the sex does not happen at all or it happens off page and it's happened, but you don't see it. Most of my books are not closed door. There's probably been a few closed door scenes possibly in some of the women's fiction novels. But I would say that, if we're going spice level, how much of the chili's out? Do we have 5? Or I'd say mine, if it's out of 5, 1 being no, nothing at all, 5 being every second page has got sex. I'd say mine would be a 2 to 3 heat level. And so yeah, I probably, try. I've been pulled back a few times in traditional publishing by my editors and publishers, because I think a lot of my books are read by, I would say, people that don't necessarily want loads and loads of spice. But then it's bizarre, because then when I question my readers, other ones are like, all the spice. So, I think it's really hard when you do have sort of quite a general readership. You can't, so that's why I probably do a little bit, but not saying that the more books I write, the less I feel like I want to write sex, to be honest. And maybe that's because it's harder to, be original and all that sort of stuff. But also, one thing I've probably said on this podcast before, or maybe I've said it somewhere, I don't know, is that someone told me a few years ago, and I can't remember who, that an emotionally revealing conversation where, you're vulnerable with each other is worth like, a dozen first kisses or a sex scene in that. Right. And so I think that goes back to, if there is a sex scene, it really needs to, if you are going to show it on the page, to me, I want it to really mean something for both the characters. And I don't mean that they mean something in like, oh, it's important and charity, I mean that it's going to really challenge who they are as a person, kind of affect where they thought they were going. It's going to change things. And I've realized I don't necessarily need to see, all of that to, I can just hint at that, if that makes sense. So maybe I'm getting older, maybe, I don't know, but I do feel like I'm probably leaning out of the full on sex scenes a little bit.
Well,
Okay,
there is so much else to write, there are other things to do.
Your women's fiction novels don't really have sex scenes.
They don't at all. And that's partly because I just don't think they belong there. And if I put them, it would be artificial. And there's a lot of other stuff to write that I have. Usually around 4 main characters, 4 different points of view. I just don't have the time.
I think it also feels, because I'm thinking about my sort of women's fiction novels, there's probably a couple of sex scenes, but it very much depends, like, on. I don't think they're definitely not as graphic if they are, but I feel like that readership kind of thing. You pick up sort of a general fiction relationships novel, you don't necessarily expect to have sex scenes, so that can be jarring.
That's right.
Whereas if you're reading a romance novel, in this day and age, you kind of often, you expect that possibly there will be, sex, unless you're looking for specific clean closed door romances.
Yeah. So the part of what's great about the BookTok phenomenon is that there are now different spice levels and different sorts of books for pretty much everyone, I think.
Yeah. For everyone. Yep.
Yeah, with indie authors publishing their novels and not having any gatekeeping going on by traditional publishers in terms of spice level and the sorts of stories they want to tell, there is so much out there, and TikTok is definitely the place to find it. I think I can't imagine there's another platform with as much discussion around different types of books.
Yeah, I completely agree.
It's on TikTok. So listener, I should say, but if you are a reader listener who is yet to find the sort of spice you like or romance story you like, do consider going on TikTok and searching through using hashtags or just search terms. People use TikTok as a search engine now, so you may find it. And there are plenty of really passionate readers on there who give great recommendations. I've certainly discovered books on TikTok that I would never otherwise have come across, just because discoverability gets harder and harder, I think. So I really appreciate the passion of the BookTokers who spend so much time reading and then making videos.
I need to get back on there because I haven't spent enough time on TikTok recently. But it's been good for my TBR pile, I have to say. It hasn't.
Well,
I haven't added as much. I still add daily, but I haven't added like 10 books a day.
Yeah, I have been guilty of adding things hand over fist to the TBR pile. TikTok, but I love that development in our writing, publishing, book selling world. That some people I know are quite judgmental about BookTok. I know there are some booksellers who will not stock books that are popular on TikTok.
Really? Wow.
Well, I think people shouldn't be reading them, and I really wonder who they think they are to say that people shouldn't be reading books that bring joy or distraction or whatever it is. This, we're basically talking about entertainment here, but for some people, just say you have had some form of trauma related to sex, whatever's happened. You might have been sexually assaulted, or there can be all sorts of reasons. Reading books, particularly written by women, where that's back to that female gaze and the female-centric space, that can be a way of finding different stories to help you get a different perspective on things.
Yeah, who is anyone to say? I mean, that also almost is on the whole book banning books. I mean, I guess if you own a bookstore, it's your decision whether or not, what you stock and that. But yeah, that is kind of saying what you think one person should read. Like that's a dangerous place to go, I think.
Well, it's a quality judgment, because it's not so much, this is dangerous material. It's more that these sorts of books are not.
Well, that gets back to the quality. Good quality writing. What's good writing? What's not good writing? And I really hate that whole discussion, because really, if a story is a page turner and people talk about it, it's good writing.
If it makes you feel something, if you've had a response, if it's been entertaining for you, any of these things mean it's good writing.
Exactly. We should probably wrap up. But I hope you've enjoyed us talking about sex in books. And
lots to talk about there.
If you have any questions, we've got a few reader questions, listener questions, I should say, coming up, which we're really excited about answering, but we've always got time for more. So if you would like to ask us any questions about writing, publishing, reading, yoga, if you want to know what Sophie, I don't really know much. I can talk about dog walking, ask us questions.
You can DM us, or the email address will be in the show notes.
Excellent. Well, you have a good night, Soph.
You too. See you soon. Bye.